I always knew there were things I wasn't supposed to see. When you serve long enough at the top, you start to understand how compartmentalization works. The military, especially in intelligence, runs like a machine with parts that only barely touch each other. But every now and then someone like me gets to peek at the full blueprint. I was a colonel in the Air Force with 25 years of service. Most of that time I worked in operations and intelligence. My job wasn't glamorous. I wasn't flying jets or saving hostages. My work was behind the scenes, strategizing missions, analyzing data, coordinating teams. But in 2012, I got pulled into something that wasn't on any mission list. It started with a phone call. Colonel Davis, report to Building 4, 1800 hours, classified briefing, dress blues required. Building 4 was the kind of place you didn't enter unless you had the right clearance and the right connections. It was deep inside Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Everyone whispered about the things that happened there, but no one really knew. That day I found out. I arrived early, my uniform pressed and my nerves steady. Inside, I passed 2 armed guards who scanned my ID twice before escorting me down a sterile hallway. At the end was a conference room with no windows, a single long table, and 5 other men already seated. They were all senior officers or high-ranking civilians. Some I recognized, most I didn't. We waited in silence for 10 minutes until the door opened again. In walked a man I'd never seen before, wearing a black suit and carrying a briefcase. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The way he carried himself, the air of authority, told me he wasn't someone you questioned. I'm here on behalf of a program you've never heard of, he began. And I need to make it clear. Everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest level. You will not speak of it outside these walls, not even to each other unless instructed otherwise. He let the words hang in the air, waiting for any of us to flinch. No one did. He set the briefcase on the table, opened it, and pulled out a thin stack of documents and a small laptop. He pressed a button on the laptop, and the lights dimmed as a projector came to life. The first image was of a metallic object hovering over a desert landscape. It was grainy, like something out of an old VHS tape, but the shape was unmistakable, a disc, smooth and reflective, with no visible seams or propulsion system. This footage was captured in 2004 by the USS Nimitz strike group during a training exercise off the coast of California, the man said. The object you see here is an unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAP. It was tracked by radar, observed visually by pilots, and recorded on FLIR video. It exhibited flight characteristics that defy known physics: instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic speeds, and the ability to maneuver without generating heat or sonic booms. He paused to let that sink in. Around the table, no one said a word. Over the next hour, he walked us through more footage, more reports, incidents dating back decades. Some I'd heard whispers about, like the 1980 Rendlesham Forest incident in England, where U.S. airmen reported strange lights and physical contact with a craft. Others were completely new to me. But the final piece of evidence was what shook me to my core. "This," he said, as the projector displayed a photograph of what looked like an oblong metallic object lying on a flatbed truck, was recovered from a crash site in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. I couldn't help myself. "Are you telling us that Roswell was real?" I asked. The man looked directly at me, his expression unflinching. "Colonel, Roswell was just the beginning." The room was silent again. But this time it was different. I could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. "This briefing," he continued, "is part of your induction into a program called Majestic 12. Your clearance level has been upgraded, effective immediately. Your role will be to assist in the analysis and dissemination of information related to UAPs and extraterrestrial technology. You are now part of a very small group of individuals entrusted with protecting this information from the public and our adversaries." He closed the laptop and the lights came back on. "This is not a question of belief," he said. "This is a matter of national security. Welcome to the program." After the briefing, I wasn't sure what to think. The idea that aliens, or something not of this earth, were real wasn't just absurd. It felt impossible. My entire career had been grounded in logic and science, yet there I was, being sworn into a program that treated the existence of extraterrestrial life as a foregone conclusion. The following day, I was flown to a facility in Nevada. It wasn't Area 51, though it wasn't far from it. This place didn't have a name or a designation, just a set of coordinates. The plane I arrived on had its windows blacked out, and even as we landed, I couldn't see anything beyond the tarmac. As soon as I stepped off the plane, I was escorted by 2 armed guards into a nondescript building. The interior was cold and sterile, all concrete and metal. I was led down a series of hallways and into an elevator that descended so far I felt my ears pop. When the doors opened, I was in what I can only describe as a massive underground warehouse. Rows upon rows of storage containers stretched into the distance, each marked with alphanumeric codes I didn't recognize. Overhead lights cast an artificial glow, but the air was still and heavy, like the place hadn't been disturbed in years. "This is Site Echo," my escort said. "It's one of several facilities where we store and study recovered materials." "Recovered materials?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Craft debris, biological samples," he replied matter-of-factly. Biological samples. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter. I was introduced to a man named Dr. Marcus Renfield, a physicist who had been working at the site for over a decade. He was tall, thin, and spoke with the kind of detached precision you'd expect from someone who spent most of their life around equations and lab equipment. "I understand you're here to familiarize yourself with the scope of our work," he said. "We'll start with something simple." Simple wasn't the word I'd use to describe what he showed me. In a sealed lab, behind a wall of reinforced glass, was an object about the size of a car door. It was metallic, but not like any metal I'd ever seen. The surface was smooth and seamless, yet it seemed to shift subtly, as though the material were alive. "This is a fragment of what we call craft theta," Dr. Renfield explained. "It was recovered in 1987 from a crash site in the Siberian tundra. Its composition is unlike anything found on Earth. It's primarily composed of an element we've yet to identify, with atomic properties that suggest it was engineered on a molecular level." I stepped closer to the glass, trying to wrap my mind around what I was seeing. "Engineered by who?" I asked. Dr. Renfield gave me a look that said I already knew the answer. "What's more," he continued, "the material exhibits properties that challenge our understanding of physics. It can absorb and redirect energy, including electromagnetic waves, with near-perfect efficiency, and under certain conditions, it becomes completely weightless." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "This isn't just advanced technology," he said. "It's centuries, possibly millennia, beyond anything humanity is capable of." We moved on to another lab, where he showed me what looked like a flight recorder. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and covered in strange, intricate symbols. "This device was recovered from the Roswell incident," he said. "We've been studying it for decades, but we've only scratched the surface of its functionality. The symbols appear to be some form of written language, but we haven't been able to decipher it." "Have you tried communicating with whoever made it?" I asked. Dr. Renfield hesitated, then nodded. "We've attempted contact using various methods, radio signals, light patterns, even mathematical sequences. But if they're receiving our messages, they haven't responded. At least, not in any way we can understand." It was overwhelming. Every question I asked only led to more questions. By the end of the day, my mind was spinning with information I could barely process. But the most unsettling moment came just before I left. As we passed through another section of the warehouse, I noticed a storage container that was heavily secured, with biometric locks and warning signs plastered across its surface. I stopped and asked what was inside. Dr. Renfield glanced at the container, then at me. "That's not something you need to worry about right now," he said. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a warning not to push any further. I didn't sleep much that night. The images of the craft fragment, the symbols, and that mysterious container played over and over in my mind. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a void I couldn't comprehend. And I knew that this was only the beginning. By the time I'd spent a few months working with the program, I thought I had a handle on the scope of what I was dealing with. The recovered materials, the covert facilities, the way every question was answered with carefully chosen words that raised more doubts than they resolved. But then something happened that shattered whatever sense of control I had left. It was late one evening when I was called into an emergency meeting. The facility's intercom blared my name, instructing me to report to the operations center immediately. When I arrived, the room was in chaos. Scientists and military personnel crowded around monitors, their faces pale and tense. "What's going on?" I asked. Dr. Renfield looked up from a console. "We've got a situation," he said. On the largest monitor, I saw what appeared to be a live satellite feed. The image showed a barren stretch of desert, illuminated by moonlight. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at, but then I noticed the object. It was hovering just above the ground, a dark, elongated shape about the size of a small jet. It didn't resemble any aircraft I'd ever seen. There were no wings, no visible engines, no exhaust. It was silent and still, like it had been placed there by some invisible hand. "We picked it up on radar about an hour ago," Dr. Renfield explained. "It appeared out of nowhere, just inside the Nevada test range. No heat signature, no electromagnetic emissions, nothing." "Could it be one of ours?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "If it is, nobody's claiming it." The room fell silent as everyone watched the feed. The object remained motionless, its surface reflecting the faint light of the stars. Then, without warning, it began to move. At first it was slow, almost imperceptible, but then it accelerated, darting across the screen in a blur. The camera operator struggled to keep up, panning wildly as the object zigzagged across the desert. "What the hell is it doing?" someone muttered. "Testing us," Dr. Renfield said grimly. As we watched the object perform maneuvers that defied the laws of physics, it stopped and started on a dime, made sharp turns at impossible angles, and accelerated to speeds that would rip any human pilot apart. "Are we scrambling jets?" I asked. Dr. Renfield hesitated. "We've sent a team to investigate," he said, "but we're keeping it low-key. The last thing we need is a panic." It wasn't long before the team arrived on the scene. A convoy of unmarked vehicles carrying armed personnel and scientific equipment. The feed switched to a body camera worn by one of the operatives, giving us a first-person view of what was happening on the ground. As the convoy approached the object, it stopped moving and hovered in place. The operatives disembarked cautiously, their weapons raised, and began to fan out around it. "What's the protocol for this?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. "There is no protocol," Dr. Renfield admitted. "Not for something like this." One of the operatives, a man named Carter, stepped forward with a device that looked like a high-tech Geiger counter. He approached the object slowly, scanning it as he went. "I'm getting some kind of reading," Carter said. "It's faint, but it's there." "What kind of reading?" Dr. Renfield asked over the radio. "Radiation, maybe? Or something else, I don't know. It's not like anything I've seen before." As Carter got closer, the object began to emit a low hum. The sound was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, resonating through the speakers in the operations center. "Carter, back off!" Dr. Renfield ordered, but before he could, the object reacted. There was a flash of light, blinding and white-hot, that filled the screen. The feed cut out for a moment, replaced by static. When it came back, the camera was on the ground, tilted at an angle. All we could see was dirt and the edge of the object, which now glowed faintly with a pulsating light. "Carter, report!" Dr. Renfield shouted into the radio. There was no response. The other operatives scrambled to recover him, but the moment they got too close, the object pulsed again. This time the light was accompanied by a shock wave that knocked everyone off their feet. The camera feed went dark, and the room erupted into chaos. "Shut it down," someone yelled. "There's nothing to shut down," another voice replied. For hours we monitored the situation, but there was little anyone could do. The object remained where it was, unyielding and inscrutable. By dawn it had vanished, leaving no trace behind. The official report labelled the incident as an anomalous event and classified it under the highest level of secrecy. Carter's body was never recovered, and the rest of the team was sworn to silence. But I couldn't forget what I'd seen, or the implications of what it meant. That night as I lay in bed, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The object hadn't just been testing us, it had been watching us, and I had the sinking feeling that it wasn't the first time. In the days following the Nevada incident, the mood within the program changed. The usual air of quiet confidence, the belief that we were the ones holding all the cards, had evaporated. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if the walls themselves had ears. It wasn't paranoia. It was a recognition that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. I spent the next week buried in reports, analysing every shred of data collected during the event. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. The object's ability to appear and disappear, its seemingly intentional response to human presence, and its apparent disregard for the laws of physics. All of it pointed to intelligence. Not just intelligence, but intent. It wasn't until I was summoned to a secure briefing that I began to grasp the true extent of the situation. The briefing took place in one of the deepest levels of the facility, a room I'd never been to before. The walls were reinforced with layers of steel and concrete, and the air felt heavy with the weight of countless secrets. When I entered, there were only 4 other people in the room. Dr. Renfield, 2 men in dark suits who didn't bother introducing themselves, and General Whitaker, a man whose name alone was enough to make most people in the military sit up straight. Whitaker was a legend, one of those figures who seemed to exist only in whispered stories told in dimly lit bars. "Take a seat, Colonel," Whitaker said, motioning to the chair across from him. I sat and the briefing began. "What you witnessed in Nevada was not an isolated incident," Whitaker said, his voice calm but firm. "It's part of a pattern that goes back decades, if not longer." He reached into a briefcase and pulled out a stack of folders, each stamped with the word "Top Secret" in bold red letters. He slid one across the table to me. "Open it," he said. Inside were photographs, reports and sketches. The photographs were grainy, taken long before the days of high-resolution cameras, but they were clear enough to show what they needed to: objects in the sky, strange lights and debris fields that didn't match any known material. "The first documented encounter was in 1947, Whitaker explained. "Roswell, you've heard the story, I'm sure. A weather balloon, they called it. That's what the public was told, anyway." I nodded, flipping through the pages. "And what was it really?" "A crash," he said. "A recovery operation. But it wasn't just debris we found. There were biological entities." I looked up sharply. "You're saying there were bodies?" Whitaker's expression didn't change. That's exactly what I'm saying, and Roswell wasn't the only incident. There have been dozens, hundreds of encounters since then. Some were recoveries like Roswell, others were sightings, anomalies, or unexplained phenomena. Together they paint a picture that's hard to ignore. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Why keep it a secret? Why not tell the public? Dr. Renfield, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Because the public isn't ready, she said. Imagine the panic, the societal upheaval, religion, politics, economics. It would all be turned upside down. And it's not just about panic, Whitaker added, it's about control. The minute this gets out, it becomes a free-for-all. Every nation, every corporation, every rogue actor with a grudge will want a piece of the action. And let's not forget what happens if these things turn hostile. I couldn't argue with that. Still, it felt wrong. Like we were playing God with the truth. Whitaker must have seen the doubt on my face because he leaned forward and fixed me with a piercing stare. Listen to me, Colonel. I don't like keeping secrets any more than you do, but this is bigger than us, bigger than any of us. Our job is to protect this planet, and sometimes that means making hard choices. You understand that, don't you? I nodded reluctantly. I understand. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in over our heads. The rest of the briefing was a blur. They talked about reverse engineering, about the breakthroughs we'd made in propulsion, materials science, and energy production. All of it thanks to the artifacts we'd recovered over the years. They also mentioned the risks. Radiation sickness, unexplained illnesses, and, in some cases, deaths among those who had worked too closely with the materials. But the thing that stuck with me most was the final folder they gave me. Inside was a single photograph, taken from a reconnaissance plane over the Pacific Ocean. It showed a massive underwater structure, something that didn't belong. "We call it the anomaly," Whitaker said. "We've been monitoring it for years. It doesn't move, it doesn't emit any signals, but it's there. And we have reason to believe it's not natural." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's the million-dollar question," he said. "But here's the part that should really keep you up at night. It's not ours, and it's not theirs. As far as we can tell, it predates both of us." I left that room with more questions than answers, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in my life, I felt truly small, like a single drop in an ocean of incomprehensible mysteries. That night, as I sat alone in my quarters, staring at the photograph of the anomaly, I realized something. We weren't just being watched, we were being studied. The weeks following the briefing were a whirlwind of activity. I was pulled deeper into the program than I had ever thought possible. They called it Project Aegis, an umbrella operation encompassing everything we knew about extraterrestrial phenomena, from the wreckage at Roswell to the underwater anomaly. It didn't take long for me to realize that the secrecy wasn't just about protecting the public. It was about protecting ourselves from the truth and, potentially, from them. By then, I had been exposed to information that most people wouldn't even dream existed. I had seen the schematics for propulsion systems that defied the laws of physics, read reports of biological samples that couldn't be classified as terrestrial or extraterrestrial, and heard audio recordings of intercepted signals, sounds that still haunt me. They weren't random noises or static, they were structured, deliberate, and almost melodic. The program had a motto: "Stay ahead, stay alive." It wasn't just about defense, it was about survival. One evening I was summoned to a high-priority meeting at the Nevada facility. This time the atmosphere was different, more tense than usual. The room was filled with people I didn't recognize, some wearing badges that I didn't know existed. At the head of the table was General Whitaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone grave, "we have a situation." He turned to a large screen on the wall. A satellite feed showed an image of Earth's atmosphere, where several glowing orbs hovered in formation. They were the same kind of orbs I had seen during the Nevada incident, but this time there were dozens of them. They arrived 3 hours ago, Whitaker continued. They're holding position in the upper atmosphere, directly over major population centers: Washington, Moscow, Beijing, London, and a dozen others. The room fell silent. They're not broadcasting anything? Someone asked. Whitaker shook his head. No signals, no attempts at communication. They're just there. Dr. Renfield stood and gestured to the screen. We've analyzed their patterns, and it's clear they're not random. This is coordinated, deliberate, but we don't know their intentions. Whitaker leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room. That's where you come in, he said, looking directly at me. Me? You were on the ground during the Nevada incident. You've seen these things up close. We need someone who understands the stakes, someone who can think clearly under pressure. What are you asking me to do? We're sending a team up to establish contact, Whitaker said. You're leading it. The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. Our team was small, just me, Dr. Renfield, and 2 others. Major Ellis, an experienced pilot, and Lieutenant Garza, a linguistics expert. Our mission was simple on paper: approach the orbs, attempt communication, and gather intelligence. But we all knew the risks. The craft we were using was unlike anything I'd ever flown in, a hybrid vehicle built using reverse-engineered alien technology. It was sleek, silent, and terrifyingly fast. As we strapped in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into the unknown in every sense of the word. The launch was smooth, and within minutes we were approaching the nearest orb. Up close, it was even more mesmerizing. Its surface shimmered like liquid mercury, constantly shifting and reflecting light in impossible ways. Establishing communication, Garza said, his voice steady despite the tension in the cabin. He broadcasted the universal language of mathematics: prime numbers, geometric patterns, binary sequences. For a moment there was nothing. Then the orb pulsed, a single rhythmic glow. They're responding, Renfield whispered, her voice filled with awe. Garza continued broadcasting, this time using simple linguistic phrases encoded in patterns. Again the orb pulsed, this time with a more complex rhythm. It was as if it were trying to mimic our signals, trying to communicate. Whatever it's doing, it's learning, Renfield said, her fingers dancing across her tablet. Suddenly the orb's surface shifted and a beam of light shot out, enveloping our craft. The controls went dead, and for a moment I thought we were done for. But instead of an attack, the light seemed to scan us, probing, analyzing. Then the beam vanished and the orb began to move, rising higher into the atmosphere. They're retreating, Ellis said, his voice filled with disbelief. No, I said, watching the screen. They're regrouping. When we returned to Earth, the orbs were gone, disappeared as suddenly as they had arrived. The mission was deemed a success, but none of us felt victorious. Whatever the orbs were, they had made one thing clear. They were watching, waiting, and learning. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something, that their brief appearance was a test. And if it was, what were they preparing for? I left the program soon after. Officially, I retired. Unofficially, I was burned out, haunted by the knowledge that there are things out there far beyond our comprehension. I'm telling you all this now because I believe the public deserves to know, not to cause panic, but to prepare. Because one day they will come back. And when they do, I can only hope we're ready.